What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Who Wants to Brawl YouTube channel. That is not a question, that is a statement. My name is Who, and I'm letting you know I want to brawl. Here, we're all about the Magic format Brawl, specifically in regards to Magic Arena, so we don't have to worry about budget, we only have to worry about wildcards.
Today we have an in the deck card review. Whenever a new set comes out, I do a review video of the commanders and the cards that go in the deck, and today we're going to be talking about the cards that are in the deck that are not the commander. Next up we have Doomscar, which for 3 white is a sorcery that says destroy all creatures, but you can foretell it for 1 white. This immediately becomes one of the best mass removal spells in Brawl at the current metagame. If you're playing against an aggressive deck, stashing this away on turn 2 and then letting them play out their hand will give you such a huge advantage, it's kind of hard to quantify. If their board isn't currently a threat, you can just let this linger over them and they won't play out their hand. If their board is a threat immediately, you get this on the cheap. I don't see any way this isn't played a lot in Brawl. Like I said, without having played with it, I think this is one of the best mass removal spells, if not the best mass removal spell in Brawl right now. Next up we have Glorious Protector, which is 4 mana for a 3/4 Cleric Angel. It has Flash and Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile any number of non-angel creatures you control until Glorious Protector leaves the battlefield, and it has Foretell for 2 and a white. This is one of the best anti-board wipe cards I've seen in a while, especially if your creatures have enter the battlefield effects, so think a deck like Yorion or something along those lines, because you can flash this in as they cast their board wipe, this dies to the board wipe, and then you get all of those enters the battlefield effects again. So this is a strong card. I like it a lot. Be careful if your opponent has 4 mana open and you cast a board wipe, just be prepared for this card. So next up we have Rally the Ranks, which is a 2 mana enchantment that says as it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, and creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So no need to overthink this one. If you have a white tribal deck, it goes in it. If you don't, it doesn't go in it. No need to overthink it. Next up we have Resplendent Marshal, which is 1 white for a 3/3 Angel Warrior with Flying. It says when it enters the battlefield or dies, you may exile another creature card from your graveyard. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control other than Resplendent Marshal that shares a creature type with the exile card. So this might be a decent card to run in a tribal. I don't see why they had to exclude this card from its own ability. It doesn't feel like it would be that much more broken if it did. I like that it's when it enters the battlefield or dies. I do think, however, the price of this is a little bit too high with not enough of a payoff frequently enough for it to be played, but I could be wrong. I guess we'll have to see how it goes. I'm not in love with this. I wish it was a little bit better. It feels like a card that's going to do a lot of work in Limited and not see much play elsewhere. Next up we have Righteous Valkyrie, which is 2 and a white for an Angel Cleric. It's a 2/4 flyer, and it says whenever another angel or cleric enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. Then, as long as you have at least 7 or more life than your starting life total, creatures you control get +2/+2. This is an absolutely incredible life gain payoff, especially since clerics was the black-white archetype of Battle for Zendikar. I can see you being able to gain a lot of life with this, and then giving all of your creatures +2/+2, including Righteous Valkyrie, is a really powerful effect. I like this card a lot, especially in the current metagame that has a pretty decent life gain deck in Heliod. This is going to see a lot of play, it's going to put in a lot of work, and if you play that deck, you're definitely going to want to include this. You're probably going to have to change some of the deck to include a little bit more clerics or angels, but I think it's going to be worth it just to see this card go off. Next up we have Runeforged Champion, which for 2 and a white is a 2/3 Dwarf Warrior that says when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library and or graveyard for a rune card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. Then it says you may pay 1 generic rather than pay the mana cost for rune spells you cast. So to evaluate this card, we have to decide what we think of the rune cards. This set introduces the mechanic of a rune aura, which says enchant permanent. When they enter the battlefield, draw a card. If enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+1 and a keyword associated with that color. It also says if an equipment is enchanted, it gives the equipped creature gets +1/+1 and the keyword ability. Whew, that's a mouthful. So these are all really interesting. I don't know if enchanting them on an equipment is the best use of mana, because it's going to require a lot of mana to equip it and enchant the equipment with this. It is nice that each of them draws a card as they enter the battlefield, and with the Runeforged champion on the battlefield, it is nice that you can only pay 1 and ignore the color cost. But I'm just not entirely sold that these are going to be viable to play in Brawl. They seem more like a fun limited thing. So experiment around, see if it works, but I'm probably going to avoid it. Next up we have Search for Glory, which is a 3-mana snow sorcery. It says search your library for a snow permanent card, a legendary card, or a saga card. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. You gain 1 life for each snow mana spent to cast this spell. This is a much more flexible search effect than Idyllic Tutor, and therefore I like this card a lot more. Searching for any legendary card or any snow card is great. Plus the sagas in this format are really usable. I like this a lot. Throw in the gain life and you have a good card, especially in a deck like Heliod that can use the life gain and the search effect. This card is going to see a lot of play. So next up we have Starnenheim Unleashed, which is a 4-mana sorcery that says create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. If this spell was foretold, create X of those tokens instead, and we can foretell it for a white X and X. So back in the day, Serra Angel was considered the best multiplayer creature. Now creatures were nowhere near as strong back then, but Serra Angel was 5 mana for a 4/4 flying vigilance. If you foretell this on turn 2, and then cast it on turn 5, it's literally just 5 mana for 2 Serra Angels versus 1. And it only gets more efficient the more mana you put into it. Having a failsafe of 4 mana for a 4/4 flying vigilance is a really nice failsafe. I'm excited to see how the foretell mechanic works. I'm pretty sure it's going to work out pretty well. I could be wrong on that, but it looks really promising, and this is a card that it looks really promising for. I like this card a lot. I have a feeling we're going to see it a lot, but again, that all depends on how good the foretell mechanic is. Next up is Valkyrie Harbinger, which for 6 mana is a 4/5 flying lifelink, and at the beginning of each end step, if we gained 4 or more life this turn, we can create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. I like this card a lot in a deck that's going to gain life. I like that it can come down and create that angel token immediately if you already have help on the board. Also, if you can swing with it, it gives you the 4 life on its own, being a 4 power creature with lifelink. I actually think this is what white has been lacking, a good life gain payoff. There's a lot of life gain decks out there, and this is just another tool for them. And now we have Alrund's Epiphany, which is a 7-mana sorcery that says create 2 1/1 blue bird creature tokens with flying. Take an extra turn after this one, exile Alrund's Epiphany. And it also has foretell for 6 mana, which means during our turn we can pay 2 and exile this card, and then cast it later for its foretell cost of 6. I like this card a lot, especially if you're running a Planeswalker as your commander. I can see this fitting right in with a Narset deck, and it's going in mine when the set comes out. It's a perfect card in a deck like that. It's just a generically good card. There's not much to say about it that hasn't already been said about an extra turn. Obviously, an extra turn is great. I just like the foretell aspect of it, and the fact that it comes with some bodies. That's a really cool ability. Really cool card. I like this card a lot, and it's definitely going to see a lot of play in Brawl decks. Expect it to be absolutely running rampant. Next up, we have Ascendant Spirit, which is 1 mana for a 1/1 snow creature spirit. And for 2 snow mana, Ascendant Spirit becomes a spirit warrior with base power and toughness 2/3. And then for 3 snow mana, if it's a warrior, put a flying counter on it, and it becomes a spirit warrior angel with base power and toughness 4/4. And then for 4 snow mana, if it's an angel, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and it gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So activating this card's abilities are a little bit too inefficient for standard or constructed, and it's not strong enough for multiplayer. But I think Brawl is where this is going to put in the most work. Cards like this are meant for one-on-one. We had one way back in Eventide, and it saw a lot of work in one-on-one at the time. And I think this card is going to be no different. Its last ability, being able to draw you cards, is what's really going to put it over the edge as well, if you can get it there. Now, getting it to its final stage does require a total of 10 mana, but you can keep activating that final ability over and over and over again and putting more counters on it. So this might be a worth it card to play. I like the design on this a lot. I'm excited to try it, and I hope it's as good as I think it's going to be. Next we have Cosmos Charger, which is 4 mana for a 3/3 flash flying, and foretelling cards from our hand cost 1 colorless less and can be done on any player's turn. And this also has foretell for 2 and a blue. 4 mana for a 3/3 flying flash is decent, but nothing special. So playing this card really comes down to how many cards with foretell you have in your deck. If you're running probably somewhere around 8 to 10, I'd say this should be included. If not, you probably should pass. This card is very much a build around. So next up we have Cyclone Summoner, which is 7 mana for a 7/7 giant wizard, and it says when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, return all permanents to their owner's hands except for giants, wizards, and lands. Agar, meet Cyclone Summoner. Cyclone Summoner, meet Agar. You're going to want to play this in a giant or wizard tribal deck, and it's going to put in a lot of work. It's also just an efficiently good card on its own in a non-giant or wizard tribal deck, so don't get too blinded by that. Bouncing all other permanents and leaving yourself with a 7/7 is no joke. This will definitely see play. I like this card a lot. It's going to put in some work, and in a giant or wizard deck, it's going to be absolutely lethal. So watch out for this. Next up, we have Graven Lore, which is 5 mana for a snow instant. It says Scry X, where X is the amount of snow mana spent to cast the spell, then draw 3 cards. So this is just a strictly better Jace's Ingenuity, which I think would have seen a lot of play in Brawl back in the day when it was legal. So I think this is going to see a lot of play. It's just a great way to refill your hand to make and smooth out your draws. I don't see a reason not to play this at the top of your curve as a reset, especially in control decks that sometimes need to reset their hand. So this is a good card. It's going to see play, and I suggest adding it to a lot of your blue decks. Next up, we have Icebreaker Kraken, which for 10 colorless, blue, so 12 mana total, is a snow creature Kraken. It costs 1 colorless less for each snow land we control, and when it enters the battlefield, artifacts and creatures target opponent controls don't untap during their untap step. And then we can return 3 snow lands we control to our owner's hand to return it to our hand. So on turn 6, if you have 6 lands, and this coming in as a 6 mana 8/8, I could see it being really nice at the top of your curve card. I just kind of wish for all of this investment that it tapped the creatures down for you. Your opponent's artifacts and creatures have to be tapped when this enters the battlefield, otherwise it's just a vanilla creature. It is nice that if your opponents attack or use their artifacts, you can bounce 3 snow lands and then play this the next turn. But each snow land you return to your hand makes this cost 2 colorless more, essentially, because it's reduced by 1 for the snow land, and then you pay 1, to cast it as a card. So I'm not sure if this card does enough for me to like it. If it tapped the creatures down, I would love this card, but I don't know. I don't know about relying on that ability. But if you manage to have 6 snowlands consistently, 6 mana for an 8/8 with upside is no joke, so run it in any deck that has a lot of snowland. Probably monocolored, just because multicolored decks are going to have non-basic snowland just for mana fixing, but in a monocolored deck that has all snowland, I can see this being a good card anyway. Next up, we have Mystic Reflection, which is a 2-mana instant. It says choose target non-legendary creature. The next time one or more creatures or planeswalkers enter the battlefield this turn, they enter as a copy of the chosen creature instead. And it has Foretell for 1 blue. So this is a really useful card. I don't know how much we're going to see it. It's got kind of a niche effect, but a really useful one. If you're running a token deck or some creatures that you're just planning on sacrificing or something along that line, you want to run this card and play it when they cast their commander, and their commander enters the battlefield as one of your useless creatures. And it's not just their commanders, it's their big creatures or their planeswalkers, which always run a train, anything of that sort. If you have small vanilla type creatures or creatures that only work in your deck or anything of the sort, you're definitely going to want to run this. It can basically shut down a lot of decks. And in decks where you have tokens or smaller creatures, once you get a bigger creature on the battlefield, you can have those smaller creatures enter the battlefield as a copy of your bigger creature. So say you have an Elder Gargaroth on the table, and then you go to make like 3 insect creature tokens with, say, I don't know, Scute Swarm. You can have all those Scute Swarms enter the battlefield as a copy of your Elder Gargaroth. Also, this is my favorite art in the set. Have to comment on that. That is absolutely beautiful with the shark coming out of the spell. Amazing. Next up, we have Reflections of Litjara, which is a 5-mana enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, we choose a creature type, and whenever we cast a spell of the chosen type, we copy that spell, and copies of a permanent enter the battlefield as a token. So any blue deck that is tribal based is going to want to run this. It's just free value once it's all on the battlefield. Most decks that play blue have at least some control element to them as well, so the 5-mana part isn't going to be too bad to deal with in Brawl. It's a fun card. I like the design a lot, and I'm looking forward to playing this in a wizard type deck. So the next card on our list is Surtland Elementalist, which for 5 generic blue and blue, 7 CMC, is a giant wizard, is an 8/8 giant wizard. As an additional cost to cast this spell, reveal a giant or pay an additional 2. And whenever it attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery from your hand without paying its mana cost. The idea of this card seems pretty fun, but with already a high casting cost, an additional cost required to pay for it, and an ability that requires it to attack to get any value out of, I don't see this seeing play very much in Brawl at all. I don't think I would play it even in a giant deck or even in a wizard deck. It's just way too much mana. At that amount of mana, you could be casting Kiora Best the Sea God and winning in a turn or two. Also keep in mind that when you cast it from your hand, you're not copying it, so you're getting rid of that card from your hand. This card doesn't seem worth it to me. Too much mana, too much of a cost, and not enough of a payoff. Maybe the commander players can have fun with this, but I don't see Brawl players being that attractive. Next up, we have Blood on the Snow, which is 6 mana for a snow sorcery. It says choose one, destroy all creatures, or destroy all planeswalkers. Then return a creature or planeswalker card with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of snow mana spent to cast this spell. This is an absolute must, especially once you convert all of your lands into snow lands. It's a way of resetting the board and then making sure you still have the best thing on the table. I suggest taking out a reanimation spell you already have and counting this as a reanimation spell. It's essentially reanimation with upside versus a destruction spell with upside. I mean, I guess it's technically both, but leaving behind the best card on the table is always an amazing effect for a Wrath effect. Next up, we have Burning Rune Demon, which is 4 black, for a creature Demon Berserker. It has flying, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for exactly 2 cards not named Burning Rune Demon that have different names. If you do, reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them, put the chosen card into your hand and the other into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. So right off the bat, all the clauses on the search don't have any effect for Brawl. Every card in your deck has to have a different name unless you're running like the 7 Dwarves or something along those lines. So the drawbacks on the search don't really apply to this format. As for what happens with the chosen cards, putting one in your graveyard and one in your hand is still great, especially if you're running a reanimator deck or a deck that constantly brings creatures back from your graveyard to your hand. Cards like this always find a way to impact the game and are run pretty frequently. I see this getting a lot of play. Next we have Cleaving Reaper, which for 3 generic black is a 5/3 flying trample angel berserker that we could pay 3 life, return it from our graveyard to our hand, and we can activate this ability only if we had an angel or a berserker enter the battlefield under our control this turn. Angel and berserker specifically look like they're getting a lot of support in this set, as well as the angel creature type having had support for the past couple sets. This looks like it would just be a good payoff in a deck that's running a lot of those. However, the previous angels have only been white, so you're probably going to be relying heavily on this set for black angels, but it definitely could work in a deck that runs a lot of angels or a lot of berserkers. Next up we have Crippling Fear, which is 2 black for a sorcery. It says choose a creature type. Each creature other than creatures of the type of your choice get -3/-3 until end of turn. So this card, like quite a few other cards in this set, run it in a tribal deck. Doesn't really need to be in any other type. It is an efficient removal spell on its own. A lot of green decks have Scute Swarms running around, so this card gets rid of all of the Scute Swarms, and any card that does that is worth taking a look at in Brawl no matter what else it does. So keep that in mind. Okay, next up we have Draugr Necromancer, which is 4 mana for a 4/4 snow creature zombie cleric. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile that card with an ice counter on it instead. And then its second ability is you may cast spells from among cards in exile your opponent's own with ice counters on them, and you may spend mana from snow sources as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. So this creature is really interesting. First of all, you have to run a lot of snow permanents. I'm not sure how that's going to work on Magic Arena. If you're going to have to get multiple snow lands to run all snow lands. But assuming you can run all snow lands, any black deck that destroys creatures a lot, this is definitely going to want to run. This is going to allow you to cast the creatures you destroy from your opponent's cards. I fully expect to see this ran a lot, especially in decks like Rankle or Chevel, Bane of Monsters, or really any deck that's focused on destroying creatures. This is going to go in a lot of those decks, and it's going to put in a lot of work for them. Expect to see this card a lot. Next up we have Dream Devourer, which for 1 and a black is an 0/3 Demon Cleric. It says each non-land card in our hand without Foretell has Foretell. Its Foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2 colorless. And then whenever we foretell a card, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So this seems like a powerful 2-drop that on turn 4, if it's safe, you foretell 2 cards, make it a 4/3, swing in for a decent amount, and then its usefulness has run its course, so you use it as a blocker or hope they trade with it. In the later game, I think you're just going to want to cast the cards that you would foretell with this. But early in the game, if you don't need to add to the board because your opponent came out slow, this is a perfect 2-drop. Other than that though, I don't think it's the most useful card, so I guess it all depends on your deck and your strategy, whether you want to run this or not. It's a difficult card to evaluate, I'll give it that, but I can see the upside of on turn 3 or 4 stashing a couple cards away to make them cheaper in the later game can be a lot of value. Alright, next up we have Eradicator Valkyrie, which is a 4 mana Angel Berserker that's 4/3 flying, lifelink, and hexproof from Planeswalkers, and it has the Boast mechanic, which is 2 mana, sacrifice a creature. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and you can activate this ability only if this creature attacked this turn, and only once each turn. So there's nothing really special to say about this card, but it's also a pretty strong card as well. 4 mana for a 4/3 flying lifelink is going to put in work no matter what it does. Hexproof from planeswalkers is interesting. There are some planeswalkers that have removal on them, so it's nice to have protection from that. The boast mechanic is where this card is going to put in the most work. Black has a lot of creatures to sacrifice and a lot of sacrifice payoffs already. So sacrificing a creature for an edict effect can be a pretty effective way to remove some of your opponent's creatures. This creature is definitely going to do work and it's definitely going to see play. Next up we have Haunting Voyage, which is 4 black for a sorcery. It says choose a creature type. Return up to 2 creatures of the chosen type from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was foretold, return all creatures of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield instead. So between Zendikar Rising and Kaldheim, there is a large tribal emphasis, and this card is perfect in those decks. You have blue-black rogues, you have black-red berserkers, you have black-white angels, etc., etc. So if you build one of those decks, this is definitely a card you're going to want to consider. I like the way the foretell cost is a little bit more expensive, but can be so much more devastating than its regular casting cost. It's a versatile card, but I only recommend playing it in a tribal deck. So next up we have Rise of the Dreadmarn, which is 3 mana for an instant. It says create X 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, where X is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn, and you can foretell it for 1 black. So the problem with cards like this, a lot of the time, is leaving up the mana is really difficult to do. However, with the foretell of this card, that is much easier to do, leaving up 1 mana versus 3, and therefore I like this card a lot. In any deck that removes creatures frequently or that is aggressive and attacks frequently, this is a must play. So think of decks like Rankle, where Rankle is constantly making you and your opponent sacrifice creatures. This gives you creatures to sack. This is just a really efficient, really good card. I like it a lot, and I'm definitely going to put it in some deck. Next up, we have Skemfar Avenger, which is 2 mana for a 3/1 elf berserker, and it says whenever another non-token elf or berserker we control dies, draw a card and we lose a life. So a must in any elf or berserker deck, an absolute pass on any other type of deck. It really comes down to that. Not much else to say. So next up we have Calamity Bear, which is 4 mana for a 3/4 giant berserker that says if a giant source we control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage instead. Giant Tribal is getting a lot of support in this set, and this is a card that could make that deck very fun to play. For those that know my playstyle, I love red, and I absolutely love dealing as much damage as I possibly can, so a card like this speaks to me a lot. Definitely going to have to try some sort of giant tribal deck, and this card is a major reason why. I like it a lot. Next up we have Dragonkin Berserker, which is 1 in a red for a human berserker. It has first strike, it's a 2/2, and it says boast abilities you activate cost 1 less to activate for each dragon card you control. Then it has boast of 4 in a red, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. This is a great red card. In later games, sometimes when you flood out, you don't really have anything to do with your mana, and this allows you to constantly pump out 5/5 red dragons. This is going to take over games if it's allowed to stay on the table. Giving it first strike is pretty powerful too. Pair this up with Torbrand, and first strike and Torbrand go hand in hand. It's really difficult to block when this creature deals 2 more damage. A dragon deck hasn't really been viable in Brawl up until I think this set. It will be worth it with Magda, so definitely include this in Magda as well. And if you see your opponent play this card, try to remove it as quickly as possible because it will take over games. Next up we have Goldspan Dragon, which is 5 mana for a 4/4 flying haste that whenever it attacks or becomes the target of a spell, we create a treasure token, and then treasures you control have tap, sack, add 2 mana of any one color to your mana pool. So this is a really efficient card. 5 mana for a 4/4 flyer wouldn't be great, wouldn't be bad, but wouldn't be great. But it does have haste, and its second ability will give us a token as soon as it hits the battlefield. Also keep in mind that it says whenever it becomes the target of a spell, which means if you have a pump spell, it will create a treasure token off of your spells as well. So I also like that it gives you that mana back as soon as it enters the battlefield as well. It's a solid card. If you can attack with it twice without spending that first treasure, you're going to ramp out a ton in a mono red deck, and there are a lot of really powerful red cards that are high casting cost that can just absolutely take over games, and this can help you get there. Next up we have Quakebringer, which is a 5 mana 5/4 giant berserker that says your opponents can't gain life. At the beginning of your upkeep, Quakebringer deals 2 damage to each opponent. This ability triggers only if Quakebringer is on the battlefield or if Quakebringer is in your graveyard and you control a giant. So this is an interesting card. I like the shutting off life gain. That is something red does from time to time, and it can really hinder some decks while not having much downside against others. Its triggered ability is where things get interesting. So at the beginning of our upkeep, it deals 2 damage to each opponent, and this happens only if it's on the battlefield or if it's in our graveyard and we control a giant. So in a giant tribal deck, or a deck that just runs a decent amount of giants, this will be a good card to include. It doesn't even have to be on the battlefield to get value from it, and I like that a lot. Also, with the foretell mechanic, I can see that being used a lot in a giant tribal deck. Most giants aren't very low casting cost, so having something to spend your mana on turn 2 can be very useful in a high casting cost deck. Alright, next up we have Reckless Crew, which is 4 mana for a sorcery. It says create X 2/1 red dwarf creature tokens, where X is the number of vehicles we control plus the number of equipment we control. For each of those tokens, you may attach an equipment you control to it. So I can see this being run in an equipment deck, maybe with a Kiri, or a vehicle deck, definitely with Magda, who wants dwarves and wants dwarves to tap. But other than that, it's not going to see much play. It's a pretty narrow card, but in the right situations, it can be pretty explosive. So watch out for this card when you play a deck that it works in, but other than that, you really don't have to think about it. Next up, we have Surtland Flinger, which is a 5 mana 4/6 that whenever it attacks, we may sacrifice another creature. If we do, Surtland Flinger deals damage equal to the sacked creature's power to any target, and if the sacked creature was a giant, it deals double that amount of damage. Giants have gotten a little bit of support with Throne of Eldraine, and it looks like they're getting a lot of support in this set too. We have cards like Bone Crusher Giant, we have cards like Tectonic Giant, as well as like Beanstalk Giant in different colors. So if you're gonna build a deck with a lot of giants, which could be a pretty fun deck, I don't know how viable of a Brawl deck it would be, but it could be pretty fun. And if you build that deck, Surtland Flinger seems like it should be in that deck. Alright, next up we have Tybalt's Trickery, which is a 2 mana instant. It says counter target spell. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. Okay, hold on. That was a mouthful, and that was a lot to process. Just let me take a step back and think about that. Give me a second.
3 hours later.
Okay, why does this card mill? I don't get it. And why does it have to be a random number between 1, 2, or 3? It literally makes no sense. But analyzing this card, putting all the ridiculousness of this card aside, this is absolutely a chaos card, and chaos cards usually have no place in a one-on-one format. I'm sure some sadistic bastard out there is going to try this, but I can't imagine it working out well for them most of the time. My suggestion is to stay away from this so you don't have to deal with the headache of figuring out how it works. What a ridiculous card. What a fun card. I love the chaos. Don't recommend playing it though. So next up we have Tundra Fumarole, which is 3 mana for a snow sorcery. It deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Then we add 1 colorless for each snow mana spent to cast this spell. Until end of turn, we don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Wow, is this a removal card. So it only deals 4 damage and therefore doesn't take out some of the strongest cards running around in Brawl. But the fact that you get that mana back if you use snow mana, which I'm assuming you'll be running all snow-covered mountains if you're running this, in which case, this is a heck of a card. To remove something and then play, say, your commander, have Torbrand on the battlefield to make this 6 damage, and then play a bigger creature, something like Morag. This is just a really powerful, really good card, and we're going to be seeing it a lot. It's going to go in a lot of decks. And this is definitely going to be a Brawl staple. Next up, we have Battle Mammoth, which is 3 green for an elephant with trample. It says, whenever a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card, and it has Foretell for 2 green. So this card kind of epitomizes green. It's a large creature that punishes your opponent for removing that creature, and I like that a lot. You're going to want to play this in a deck that either has a lot of creatures or focuses on big creatures. It's definitely going to be a good fit in a Zalortha deck. It does have higher power than toughness, not a substantial amount, but enough. It seems like a card that's going to be played, but isn't going to completely take over games the way so many mythic rares in Brawl do. It's a good card. I definitely like what's happening here. Next up, we have Blessing of Frost, which is 3 and a green for a snow sorcery. It says distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of creatures you control, where X is the amount of snow mana spent to cast this. Then draw a card for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So my first thought when I saw this is it's a better version of the first Iroan games, which is an enchantment saga that creates a 1/1 soldier, then puts 3 counters on a creature you control, then you draw 2 cards if you have a creature with power 4 or greater, and then you create a gold token. The reason this is a better version is, yes, it is 1 more mana, but you get all those effects right away, and you can distribute the +1/+1 counters versus putting them all on 1 creature, and you don't have to pass the turn with a creature power 4 or greater and hope it survives. It just happens. So I think this is just a better version of that. Any deck you have that wants to run that, like I run that in Grakmaw, and this is just going to replace the first Iroan games in Grakmaw. So if you're running +1/+1 counters or large creatures, it's definitely a good play. Next up, we have Canopy Tactician, which is 4 mana for a 3/3 elf warrior. Other elves you control get +1/+1, and it taps to add 3 green mana. Not much to say about this one. Throw it in a deck with elves. Throw it in a green deck that needs ramp. It's going to do work. Not much else to say. Next up, we have Elvish Warmaster, which is 2 mana for a 2/2 elf warrior. That whenever 1 or more other elves enter the battlefield under our control, we create a 1/1 green elf creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. And then for 7 mana, we can give elves we control +2/+2 and Death Touch. This is a good elf payoff. All of our elves will come with another 1/1 elf, and elf decks have a tendency to ramp, so getting to 7 mana and giving all of your elves +2/+2 and Death Touch can be absolutely devastating. I like this a lot in an elf deck, but other than that, it's just kind of another elf payoff. There's nothing special about it, but there's nothing bad about it either, and that's okay. Next up, we have Iska's Chariot, which is a 4 mana 4/4 vehicle that when it enters the battlefield, we create 2 2/2 green cat creature tokens, and whenever it attacks, create a token that's a copy of target token you control. And it has crew 4. So I like that it comes down with the creatures that can crew this, and I like that it comes down with bodies that its attack trigger can clone. This card seems really interesting with cards that create a token of a creature you control, like Lithoform Engine or other cards of that ilk. This has a lot of potential, and I'm excited to see how players can take it, and I'm excited to see how I can use this card in my decks. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to put it, but I'm definitely going to try to use this. It seems like a fun card to play with. Next up we have In Search of Greatness, which is an enchantment for green. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may cast a permanent spell from your hand with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the highest converted mana cost among other permanents you control without paying its mana cost. If you don't, scry 1. So on first glance, without playing with any of the cards in this set, this feels like it's going to be the most powerful card in the set. Getting to cast a permanent spell without paying its mana cost is insane, and the fact that it allows you to keep casting a higher casting cost card is absolutely absurd. You're definitely going to want to run draw spells with this card, just because you're going to empty your hand out pretty quick, but this is an absolute must in just about any green deck. I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to run this, especially because green tends to run permanents, which means you're probably always going to have something to cast off of this. And I also like that it has a failsafe. It doesn't really need it, but the scry 1 at the beginning of your upkeep sets up your next draw. If you can't cast anything, it's just absurd. This is a great card. Put it in every green deck you can. Next up we have Old Growth Troll, which is green for a 4/4 trample troll warrior that when it dies, if it was a creature, returns to the battlefield as an aura enchantment with Enchant Forest you control, and Enchanted Forest has tap, add 2 green, and 1 mana, tap, sack it, put a 4/4 troll warrior creature token with trample onto the battlefield. This is an absolute staple in any mono green deck. I can't imagine a deck that wouldn't want this. First of all, it passes the vanilla test with flying colors as a 3 mana 4/4 trample, and then when it dies, you get to ramp on a forest, and then later in the game, turn that land into another 4/4 trampler for only 1 mana. I can't imagine any mono green deck that doesn't want to run this, and even some green decks with good mana bases that aren't mono green would want to run this. I like this card a lot, and I think we're going to see it in Brawl a lot going forward. Next up we have Realm Walker, which is 3 mana for a 2/3 changeling, which means it has every creature type, and as it enters the battlefield, we choose a creature type. We may look at the top card of our library, and we may cast creatures of the chosen type if that card is that creature type. This is pretty much just another tribal payoff. There's a lot of tribal payoffs in this set, and this gives a tribal payoff for a creature on the battlefield and card advantage from the top of your library. It's just a good card in any tribal deck. Next up we have Battle for Bredagard, which is 1 green-white for an enchantment saga. The first chapter says create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. The second chapter is create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. And chapter 3 says choose any number of artifact tokens and or creature tokens we control with different names. For each of them, create a token that's a copy of it. So if the deck you're building uses green and white and uses tokens, this is an auto include, and if it doesn't use that, there's not really much reason to run this. It seems like it could be a fun card, but it has a really narrow use. Next up we have Battle of Frost and Fire, which is a 5 mana enchantment saga that says Battle of Frost and Fire deals 4 damage to each non-giant creature and each planeswalker. Chapter 2 is Scry 3, and Chapter 3 says whenever you cast a spell with converted mana cost 5 or greater this turn, draw 2 cards, then discard a card. This is a difficult card to analyze. 5 mana for 4 damage to each non-giant creature isn't great. It is nice in a giant deck, but it's not particularly the best. Then Chapter 2 is a pretty middling Scry 3, not much else. Chapter 3 sounds great, but when you think about it, you're probably only going to cast 1 spell with converted mana cost 5 or greater, which means you're only going to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. So basically this reads 5 mana, deal 4 damage to each non-giant creature, scry 3, draw 2, discard a card, which is solid but not great, and then you stretch that out over 3 turns, and I don't think this is the best of the saga cycle in this set. So next up we have the Bears of Litjara. What a name. It's 3 mana for an enchantment saga The first chapter says create a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with changeling. The second chapter says any number of target shapeshifter creatures we control have base power and toughness 4/4. And the third chapter says choose up to one target creature or planeswalker. Each creature with power 4 or greater we control deals damage equal to its power to that permanent. So this is a really interesting design. It definitely pays you off for the 3 mana, but it's not guaranteed to remove something. But if it does remove something, it does it very efficiently. So this is a really, really well-made card. That second ability does require you to be in a shapeshifter deck, which I can see being a pretty fun deck to play. Having it be a, let's say, an elf deck, and you run all of the shapeshifter changelings. That way you get use out of that second ability, but you still get use out of its other abilities as well. This is a really cool card, really interesting design, and also the best name for a Magic card I've seen in a long time. Love that. Next up we have the Blood Sky Massacre, which is 3 mana for an enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says create a 2/3 red Demon Berserker creature token with Menace. Chapter 2 says whenever a Berserker attacks this turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. And then Chapter 3 says add 1 red mana for each Berserker you control. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. So I think this card is going to see the most play in Brawl of all formats. Brawl is where the Berserker creature type is going to be able to be a viable deck, I think. And if you make a Berserker Brawl deck, this card is an absolute must, especially that second ability. That can draw you 3-4 cards, at which point you're going to be so far ahead it's difficult for your opponent to catch back up, especially when you're playing an aggro deck like a Berserker deck. So in a Berserker deck, or if your commander is a Berserker, I would suggest playing this card. Next up is Firja's Retribution, which is a 4 mana enchantment saga. On the first chapter, we create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. For chapter 2, it says until end of turn, angels you control gain tap, destroy target creature with power less than this creature's power. And then chapter 3 says angels we control gain double strike until end of turn. So this card seems really pushed. 4 mana for a 4/4 flying vigilance is already pretty good on the vanilla test, and then you throw in those other abilities and you have a serious card on your hands. Giving your angels the ability to tap to destroy anything is amazing, especially if those angels have vigilance. You can attack and then tap and destroy them before your opponent declares blockers, which seems incredibly busted. And then the third ability, giving your angels double strike, will end a lot of games if you have even just the angel you created with this still around. This card is going to see a lot of work. It is 2 colors, but white and black are the angel colors of Kaldheim, so I think this is going to see a lot of play even though it is 2 colors. This is a really powerful card. Next up we have Herald Unites the Elves, which is a 4 mana enchantment saga. The first chapter says mill 3 cards, then you may put an elf or Tevar card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Chapter 2 says put a +1/+1 counter on each elf you control, and Chapter 3 says whenever an elf you control attacks, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1. This is a really good card in an elf deck. I like that it immediately brings the creature back. Most of the time on sagas we've seen that you have to wait until Chapter 2 or Chapter 3 to reanimate the creature. This one does it right away. That makes it a lot more palatable. The second chapter is a little bit underwhelming, but that's okay because the first and the third ones are so great. With the third one making any creature get -1/-1 for each elf you control that attacks. That can make blocking miserable. It can kill your opponent's creatures if you put it all into one creature. This is just a really good card. Next up we have Immersturm Predator, which is 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer, Vampire Dragon. It says whenever it becomes tapped, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on it. Then we can sack a creature to give it indestructible for a turn and tap it. This is a really good free sack outlet, and it has a really good payoff for it. Putting a +1/+1 counter on it and exiling a card from a graveyard, all while making it indestructible, is a really good payoff for sacrificing a creature. There are a good amount of cards in this current Brawl format that don't mind being sacrificed either, especially in black-red. So this card could see a lot of play, and I can't wait to see what people do with it. Next up we have King Narfi's Betrayal, which for 1 a blue and a black is an enchantment saga. It says each player mills 4 cards, then you may exile a creature or planeswalker from each graveyard. Chapters 2 and 3 says until end of turn, you may cast spells from among cards exiled with King Narfi's Betrayal, and you may spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast those spells. This is a strong card. It essentially draws you 2 cards, but one of them being your opponent's card can be absolutely devastating for your opponent. It also helps that it mills 4 cards, giving you a larger chance of hitting a creature. You have to make sure you run a decent amount of creatures to make sure you hit a creature as well. I think this pairs beautifully with Garuda, because that wants to mill cards for each opponent anyway. It also helps mill you if you want to get cards into your graveyard for a reanimation style deck. This is a strong card. It definitely has a lot of use, and I like it a lot. Next up we have the Raven's Warning, which is a 3 mana enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says create a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying and you gain 2 life. Chapter 2 says whenever 1 or more creatures you control with flying deal combat damage to a player this turn, look at that player's hand and draw a card. And Chapter 3 says you may put a card you own from outside the game on top of your library. So for 3 mana, Chapters 1 and 2 are pretty underwhelming. Chapter 2 would be better if it said for each creature with flying you control instead of 1 or more, so you only get that trigger once whether you hit with 3, 5, 10, or 1 creatures with flying. Chapter 3 is where this card is interesting. I'm not sure Chapter 3 will even work in Brawl. Most of the time a card that says from outside the game references your sideboard, and sideboards aren't allowed in Brawl as far as I know. I could be completely wrong on that. But if they're not allowed and we can't get any card we want, yeah, this card's not going to see much play. Next up we have Showdown of the Skalds, which is 4 mana for an enchantment saga that on the first chapter we exile the top 4 cards of our library, and until the end of our next turn we may play those cards. And then chapters 2 and 3 says whenever we cast a spell this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. So a card like this was recently banned in Standard. Escape to the Wilds. However, that card exiled 5 cards and allowed you to play an additional land the turn you cast this. I think this is a little bit more fair. You're going to want to make sure you haven't played a land when you play this card, so that way you can play the land this card would exile if it does. Other than that, it's just a really good draw engine, something Boros usually lacks, and then has a good payoff for casting spells that makes your creatures stronger, but not obscenely stronger. This is a solid card that I think is going to see a lot of play in decks that can run it. So next up we have Waking the Trolls, which is 6 mana for an enchantment saga, the first chapter of which is Destroy Target Land. The second chapter says put target land from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. The third chapter says choose target opponent. If they control fewer lands than you do, create a number of 4/4 green troll warrior creature tokens with trample equal to the difference. So this is not a card you can just throw into any red-green deck. This is a card that absolutely must be in a ramp deck and ramp lands out faster than your opponent, get to 6 mana on turn 4 and drop this then. Otherwise, the payoff is not going to be worth it. Dropping this on turn 6 when your opponent also has 6, you might miss your next land drop and they hit their next 2 or maybe even 1, and essentially you paid 6 mana to destroy one of their lands, put a land on your battlefield, and create maybe 1 troll, and that's just not worth it, especially when you get that over 3 turns. But if you can get this out early with a lot of lands on the battlefield, then yeah, this card will definitely be worth it. So this card is a build around. In the right deck, it can be devastating, but in the wrong deck, you'll find that you'll want to take it out as soon as you see it in your hand and see that it doesn't do much. It's going to work best in a Rada deck. Next up, we have Cosmos Elixir, which is a 4-mana artifact. It says at the beginning of our end step, draw a card if our life total is greater than your starting life total. Otherwise, we gain 2 life. This is pretty much a self-defining card. If you're in a life gain deck, this should be included. If you're in a control deck, it might not be a terrible idea either. It will definitely help draw out the game, no pun intended, and help ease the burden a little bit from aggro decks. This is a card that could make it in your deck and might not have to make it in your deck. I can see it going either way. So, completely a personal preference. It's up to you. Okay, next up we have Maskwood Nexus, which is a 4-mana artifact that says creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that are not on the battlefield. And then for 3 mana and tapping it, you can create a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling, which means it's every creature type. I'm going to be honest, I don't see this card getting much play at all. Any tribal deck that would run it is already running a lot of those creatures on their own, and therefore they don't need this. And I don't see any real reason to play this outside of a tribal deck. There is, however, one exception, and that is a combo with a card that will be coming up later on this review, called the World Tree. But outside of that combo, I don't see this getting much play at all. Next up we have Pyre of Heroes, which is a 2-mana artifact, and for 2 mana, tapping it and sacking a creature, we can search our library for a creature card that shares a creature type with the sacked creature and has converted mana cost equal to 1 plus that creature's converted mana cost. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle our library. And we can activate this only anytime we can cast a sorcery. So I've said it a few times in this review, but Tribal seems to be pretty strong in this set, and this is no different. This can be included in any Tribal deck, and if you have a combo piece that shares a creature type with your commander, you can run it just to tutor out that one creature. That can also be a very effective way of using this card. We've seen effects like this before in Standard, and it has absolutely run a train, so we'll see how this goes in Brawl. So next up we have Faceless Haven, which is a snow land. It taps to add a colorless, and for 3 snow mana, it becomes a 4/3 creature with vigilance and all creature types until end of turn. It's still a land. So this is just your generic manland. Manlands are always good in control decks, so if your deck is a little bit more controlling, this will be a good place for it, especially if you have Snowland, which I highly recommend converting all of your lands to Snowland. Do keep in mind that it is all creature types, so it does work if your deck is tribal based as well. Other than that though, it's just a generic manland, and those are always efficient and always useful. Next up we have Tyrite Sanctum, which is a land that taps for a colorless, and then for 2 generic, tapping it, target creature becomes a god in addition to its other types. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then 4 mana, tapping it and sacking it, we can put an indestructible counter on target god. This is just a low downside, high upside card. I don't think it's going to be too often that you're able to activate both of these abilities, but there's really not much reason to not try, especially if you don't have a lot of lands that tap for colorless in your deck already. I think where this card is best is in a Zerta deck, because those abilities essentially get halved, making these abilities a much more efficient ask. Alright, next up we have the World Tree, which is a land that enters the battlefield tap and taps for green. And then as long as we control 6 or more lands we control tap for 1 mana of any color. And then for white, blue, black, red, green, tapping it and sacking it, we can search our library for any number of god cards, put them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle our library. So this is an insane card, especially given that Theros Beyond Death is in the current Brawl format, and this set has a ton of gods. It's the fact that this card has such little downside, and fixes your mana on top of that, that makes this card absurd. Now you obviously have to play it in a 5-color deck, but this card makes playing 5 colors so much easier. Not to mention the combo previously stated with Maskwood Nexus that gets all creatures out of your library and onto the battlefield with this. This is a very low downside, almost entirely upside land that goes in any 5-color deck, regardless of if there's a lot of gods because of that second ability. This is a great card. It's going to see a lot of play. And that does it for this video. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, share with a friend to help the channel grow, hit that bell icon to make sure you get notifications about new videos to make sure you don't miss anything. I also want to give a shout out to my buddy Rob Slota for making the Who Wants to Brawl logo. He's a tattoo artist, and you can check out his Instagram by following the link in the show notes below. You can email me at whowantstobrawl@gmail.com. My Twitter is @brawlwho. I also stream on Magic Arena at twitch.tv/whowantstobrawl. Check me out on Sundays at 11 in the morning where I stream last week or next week's deck tech. On Mondays I stream random decks. Sometimes I do Brawl, sometimes I'll even throw in a draft. I also stream a random day of the week, or at least I try to. This is Random Games. Follow me on Twitter and I'll let you know when I'm going to play ahead of time and what I'm going to play ahead of time. But for now, this is Who letting you know I no longer want to brawl. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.